Marathon 79, 79. I don't know, is that a magic number? Probably not. Just another number. Just another marathon. But it's got 3 Bigfoot stories in it. I think y'all are going to enjoy it. All right, here we go. This first story is really nice. I don't know why I liked it so much, but I just did. It's not real exciting, but it is kind of sweet. It's kind of a sweet story. So here we go. My Bigfoot story is weird to say the least. I spoke to him. This one was a male, and we communicated by ESP, I think. I come from an abusive childhood. It was a daily operation to run and hide in the 5-acre state park behind my house. I know it's not a large piece of dirt, but it's huge to a small girl. I'd stay in the woods for many hours a day if I was out of school. I gained comfort from the woods. I grew up to become an addict and an alcoholic. As I write this story, I am 5 years sober. Not by my will, but by God's will. I was saved by the 12-step program. I have obsessive thinking. In order to not obsess over people, places, or things in reality, I decided that I would obsess over the mythological creature of Bigfoot. I've watched and heard so very many stories about the creature. I went to the museum in Cherry Log, Georgia, Expedition Bigfoot, twice. I was a Bigfoot fanatic and I didn't care who knew it. Bigfoot was a very safe obsession for my mind to puzzle out. My father passed away about a year ago and I became grief-filled for many months. I craved the woods. I craved the peace I had always found in the wilderness as a young girl. My brother came down to Georgia in late March or early May of 2019 to visit our mother. I asked him to go hiking with me in the Georgia foothills. The foothills have become quite populated by humans in the last few years. However, we hit the trail early in the morning and we didn't see many people out that day, mainly campers still there from the night before. We came to a waterfall about 3 miles in. Georgia had a lot of rain that winter and the creek was as full as it had ever been. The creek was full to the brim. I've done this trail many times and when I reached the falls, regardless of the season, I'd crawl out to the falls and sit in the falling water. For the first time ever, I was intimidated by the amount of water coming off the falls. I decided it was too dangerous to play in. My brother and I sat and we had a late breakfast of summer sausage, cheese, and crackers. After our meal, I walked down the trail to relieve myself. I was passed by a couple with a dog, a good-looking Brittany Spaniel, and I cursed to myself, there goes all the wildlife. My brother quit smoking a little over a year before this hike, so I decided I'd have one while I was excused from him. I went off the trail about 20 feet to the sandy edge of the creek. I was seeking a calm place to be, and I found it. It was like time had stopped. The weight of the world was lifted off me. Everything was right with the world. And then I saw it. A gray, silvery-haired arm came out from behind a tree across the creek from me. It was literally waving me down. I would have never seen it if it didn't want to be seen. It was blind to the dog's nose that had just passed by before me. I was not afraid, and I didn't smell anything. The creature came out from behind the tree and walked up to me in like 3 steps covering about 10 or 15 yards. I'm not even sure it broke the surface of the water when it stepped through it. It finally made sense to me why prints are not found after a sighting. He stayed to the right of me, and still I didn't smell him even at 3 feet away. I'm 5'10", and this creature was way taller than me, maybe 10 feet tall, I think, and maybe 4 feet across at the shoulders. It was massive, and it had a human-looking face. It had a beard, sideburns, and hair covering most of its forehead, almost like bangs. Now, if the story isn't already weird, it gets weirder. This is when the dialect starts in my head. I was instantly concerned for his family. I knew somehow that they were close, and then he asked me, "Who are you?" Somehow I knew he meant the plural you, and I told him we're the sons and daughters of Abraham. We are as numerous as the stars. And then he asked me, where should I take them? I think he was talking about his family. I've done this trail numerous times, and once I was approached by some hunters coming from the wilderness from the north. Somehow, in my mind's eye, I showed the creature the trail the hunters had used. I said it would be best to take the high trail. At that point, he took off in the direction of the high trail, once again crossing the creek without breaking the surface. I believe he stepped over the entire creek in one step. It would have taken me at least 3 or 4 steps in the water to reach the other side. All of my being wanted to go with him, but I was not invited, and somehow I knew that I would be welcome to join him. Life passed before my eyes. I dropped my knife at my hip, sheath and all, on the beach. I was going to tail the Bigfoot. However, right then I saw my brother from an aerial point of view in my mind's eye, and I knew this was not the time to go. In the 12-step program I live by, it would be against the spiritual principles to go with Bigfoot. The principles have saved my life, but I no longer survive life, I live it. I wrote this email to you up to this point back in August of 2019. It is now April of 2020. I just didn't have the guts to send it to you. As I have just reread it, it sounds so unbelievable, and if I had not seen it with sober mind and body, I would think I hallucinated the entire encounter. I believe the whole interaction took under 5 minutes. I really enjoy your YouTube channel. Your attitude of just a great story is why I feel that I can send it to you without bias. It can be just a great story of a non-aggressive Bigfoot. I think about this incident a lot more than I care to admit. I believe this really happened to me. Before this occurred, I thought if I had an encounter, I would be terrified and never enter the woods alone again. The opposite is true. I enter the woods feeling very comfortable. I know I'm being watched. I feel them watching me. It doesn't scare me. They are curious, and I'm curious too. I now believe I'll never be alone in the woods again. I'm welcome there, and if I'm not, I will be sure to know before I see anything. I think I will feel it. I have no desire to film these creatures, and I don't wish to prove to the human race that they exist. This encounter was real to me, and I'm a true believer now. I cannot wait to interact with another one, hopefully a non-aggressive Bigfoot. Thanks for listening to my story. Just telling it makes me feel better for whatever reason. Well, you all heard that. Isn't it great that she went ahead, after so many months and went ahead and sent it? And I got this story, I think it was last month, and I just by chance clicked on it today, and I thought, oh, this is great. I want to share this. So I don't have anything else to say about it, but I just want to thank the woman for sending it. She's congratulations on 5 years being sober. That's a huge achievement. It really is. I admire you, and I really appreciate you for sending the story. Thank you, ma'am. Here's a story from Tracy. I really enjoyed reading this. Sometimes I like reading them as much as I do narrating them. But if you like them, they're real easy to narrate. So here's what Tracy writes. Let's see. I've been listening to your channel for a couple of months. I finally decided it was time for me to write my story. I grew up in Doniphan, Missouri, which is southeast Missouri. It's a town surrounded by the Mark Twain National Forest. My family lived in a house bordering acres of wooded land with huge trees that I climbed and swung from branch to branch on like a monkey. I often wonder if something watched us from the woods. We never ventured into these woods because we were just little kids. We were told by the grown-ups that Momo was in those woods. Momo is the Missouri monster, which I now know the circumstances of how that came to be. Apparently, there were a lot of sightings in Missouri. In the late 70s, a large bipedal creature was spotted around Ripley County, which is where Doniphan is located. Growing up, I never heard of the Patterson-Gimlin film or In Search Of. I don't think I even knew what Bigfoot was. I was around 5 when my life changed and I was faced with something my 5-year-old mind could not make sense of. I awoke in the middle of the night to a noise beside my window. As my sleepy eyes adjusted to the darkness of my room, I found myself looking into the eyes of a creature that was staring at me through the window. It was huge and it had white hair. Yes, I said white. The only thing that made sense to me at the time was a polar bear which I had seen at the zoo. A polar bear was looking in my window. What happened next has stayed with me my whole life and I've never experienced it since. I became frozen like a statue. I could not move or scream for my parents. I've heard people talk about being zapped and I can't think of a better word for what happened to me. I was frozen and I stayed that way until the morning light came and my mom came in to wake me. With my mother there, I could now move and I told her that a polar bear was looking through my window. She says she doesn't remember the episode, but I do, and I'm pretty sure she blew it off as a dream or a nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. As I started getting older, I thought about this from time to time, and I didn't know exactly what was looking at me through the window that night. As I grew older, I realized it probably wasn't a polar bear. There are no polar bears in Missouri. My answer came at around the age of 7. We would go 30 miles away on Sundays with our parents for a movie and dinner in Poplar Bluff. There in Poplar Bluff was a museum that featured exotic animals like elephants, lions, and tigers. They were taxidermied or they were stuffed, and I loved going there to see the animals. My favorite exhibit featured the animals from the Pacific Northwest. There was one piece that I was fascinated with. This life-size animal was called a Sasquatch. It was huge and it looked real. So real, I sometimes wonder if it really was real. Probably not, but there was something eerily real about this whole thing. Finally, it came to me. I had seen this creature before. This strange Sasquatch was the polar bear that was looking at me through my window that night. How was that so when I saw white hair and this one in the museum was brown? I thought about this incident for years. In my teenage years, I started watching Finding Bigfoot and I heard similar stories. It all makes sense now. I live at Lake of the Ozarks now and I went to Donovan to visit my family. I went back to our old house to find it still there. The owners were nice enough to let me measure the window, which was 8 feet off the ground. The museum was gone, and it's now a club. I wonder where the museum went and where that Sasquatch is. If any of your listeners have any information on it, I would love to know. It was called Call to the Wild in the late 70s, and it was located in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. I hope you enjoyed my story. I love the woods and I'm often in them, hoping one day that I might be lucky enough to see one again. Sincerely, Tracy. Tracy, I know where that Call of the Wild place is. I travel through there in the early 2000s, probably a couple of times a month, and it's a strip joint. It's a club. But I know exactly where that place is because it's still got all the animal, or it did then, all the big animals drawn, painted on the outside of the store. And that's a great story. I've heard of these white Bigfoot before, but I think this might be the first email I've got in a year and a half that actually someone saw one. And the windowsill was 8 feet tall, so that thing had to be huge. And I don't doubt that that's what was looking at you through the window. They seem to be real interested in children. I don't know why, but they do seem to be interested in children. Tracy, thanks for the story. You did a great job writing it, and I loved it. Thank you. Here's an email from John. John says, I have 4 stories. 2 are stories I was told through the years by other people, and 2 are my own experiences. First, I'll tell you the story of a person who has passed away several years ago. This took place in northern New York around the Adirondack Mountains. He was a real old mountain man who has made a living most of his life hunting and trapping and also working construction. He had so many stories about his hunting and trapping days, and I could listen to them for hours. This story, as he told it, was not told as a Bigfoot story. I don't think he ever heard of them or thought they existed. As he told it to me back in the 1970s, he was in one of his favorite tree stands back in the days when he was a major deer poacher in the 50s and 60s. He was on one of his nightly missions. He was just getting into his deer stand. It was located on a ridge overlooking a shallow valley with swamp and tag alders, a place where he shot many deer. This one early night, just before it got dark to see, he said he saw a funny-looking bear walking down the middle of that valley on its back two legs and using its front arms to push the tag alders out of its way to get through the thick brush. He said he did not see its front, only the back, and found it to be odd that the bear was walking on its back legs and using its front legs like hands to push the brush to the side so he could walk through it. For years, I never gave it a second thought until I heard about Bigfoot and started to learn on the subject. I since have gotten degrees in chemistry and biology and spent years out in the woods all over the United States and Canada and many other parts of the world, including Asia and Central America. I have seen and heard just about every creature that exists, and I know their signs and calls. I know bears do not walk on their hind legs for any more than a few steps, and they always run and walk on all fours. Thinking back on his story, I could only conclude that what he saw was a Bigfoot walking away from him through the valley. Another story, and I'm not mentioning his name, he's still alive and he wouldn't want his name mentioned. But I can tell you his story. This person makes his living in the woods doing tree surveys for a tree harvesting company that takes trees all over New York State and has done so for 50 years. He told me of a few strange things he has seen deep in the woods where there are no roads and no one travels. I asked him what was the strangest thing he ever saw. He hesitated for a few moments as if thinking, but I'm not sure he was debating on whether to tell me or not. Finally, after a few minutes, he said there was this one time when he was in an area in the Adirondacks where they were cutting new roads to get to an area that has not been cut over for 100 years. It had no roads, and it was one of the most remote parts of the state. He was several miles back into the woods on foot and doing his survey. Upon cresting a ridge off in the distance, he saw something lying on a tree log that had fallen down, and it looked like it was sleeping. As he approached it and got within 50 yards of it, he jumped up and ran on 2 feet into the valley. The man said he was sure it ran on 2 feet like a man, but could not believe what he had just seen and dismissed it as just something strange, and that since it was running away from him, and saw it as no threat and continued his work. He said he did not believe in Bigfoot, but that if he had to describe what he saw that day, it would be a Bigfoot. Now for my 2 encounters that happened to me. I grew up on a farm on an off-road area that was 275 acres connected to thousands of acres of state land just behind our farm. We had a nice river that ran through our farm, and I enjoyed growing up there with all the animals and wildlife and the fishing and hunting. For the most part, we never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary except for a few times when strange things happened, like the time one of our dogs went missing after one night of hearing what sounded like wolves, but there were not supposed to be wolves where we lived. Another time, when I was trapping coons, one of the coon traps was smashed to pieces like something big just grabbed it and tore it in half. Other than that, all was normal, and we never thought of Bigfoot or talked about it. After many years, I left the farm and went out to see the world. I joined the Navy. I returned home to the farm in 1990, and I took a job at the local Sears store. We were no longer farming, and my father just kept the farm for the hay to feed the horses. It was 1995 and in the fall of the year, and it was deer season. I was out in the back 100 acres that connected to all of that state forest and swamps hunting on an old railroad bed. About an hour before dark, I saw something jump out on the railroad bed about 100 yards ahead of me, and I realized it was a big wolf. I didn't want them around for two reasons. One, I was afraid it would try to kill one of my father's horses. Two, I figured it would run the deer off the farm and ruin my hunting. I shot it thinking that I would have it mounted, but after I hit it, it ran into the thick brush and I couldn't find it. Although I had blown a hamburger-sized chunk out of its side, it kept going. At this point, it was getting late and starting to get dark, so I decided to come back the next day and track it down. I did not think it would go far, and this is where things went bad, almost like in a Twilight Zone movie. I went back around noon to track that wolf down, picking up his trail just off the railroad bed where he went into the thick brush. He took me on a merry chase over a few miles through the woods, through brush, swamps, and back and forth over that old railroad bed, and finally ending up almost back where we started, just a few hundred yards to the east of where I shot him in some of the thickest brush I had ever seen. Not even the cows or horses would go in there. I think that is why the wolf went in there. Also because I think he was about to die and maybe figured that I would not follow him in there, but I did. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to get through that stuff and to be able to see his trail. I could only find an occasional drop of blood on a leaf or twig every few yards. It was now getting late, an hour before dark, and I was getting worried. Maybe he was still alive and waiting for me to get close enough so that he could go down with a fight. Also, there was another man with permission to hunt that farm. I worried that he might see movement in that thick brush and take a shot at me. I heard something moving in the brush just 30 or 40 yards to the north out of my sight. At first, I thought it was the wolf, so I tried to work my way towards him to get a shot. But then the strangest thing began to happen. As I moved closer, it moved just out of my range of view so that I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. It could have been a deer. At least that's the way I was thinking. Then it started to circle me. I found that odd. The wolf would have moved away and not circled me, nor did I think deer would do the same. Deer don't circle people. I stood up and started to move towards it as fast as I could, and it kept just beyond my sight, moving away, and it kept moving around me. I then realized that this thing sounded more like a human walking than an animal. It was at that moment the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I started to get a real bad feeling. Maybe it was the man who had permission to hunt the farm who heard me in the brush and was trying to get a look at me, thinking that I might be a deer. But why would he back away or circle me if he was trying to get a shot? I didn't want to get shot, so I decided to break the silence and I called out. I yelled to Scott, "Is that you?" I got no answer. And then I thought it might just be another person trespassing or poaching, so I called out again, "Hey, if there's anyone over there, I've got a gun. I don't want to shoot you and I don't want you to shoot me." Still, I got no answer. This thing didn't move away or say anything. Again, I tried to get close to it, and again it circled me, only this time I heard what sounded like a loud huff, like an animal breathing out a large amount of air. At this point, I decided that whatever this thing was, it didn't want me to see it, and maybe it was better if I did not, and I turned towards the old railroad bed to the northwest and headed for my truck, and I got out of there. The next day I ran into Scott and I asked him if he went to his tree stand, and he said that he didn't go hunting yesterday because he had to work late. It was not until years later that in my town people claimed to hear screams out in the swamps in the next town over, and it was reported in the local paper that some think it was Bigfoot because it sounded like nothing they had ever heard. I thought back on that day when I was circling around in that thick brush, and I wondered if that's what it was circling me and what I heard. This story is actually connected to my next story. Encounter number 2. It was then 10 or 12 years later after my first encounter. I moved over to the next town and I bought a house that has swamps behind and in front of my house with a brook that runs just 30 yards to the left of my house. This brook and swamp system is part of a larger system that runs for many miles, starting at the foot of the Adirondacks to the St. Lawrence Valley in New York. Many animals travel this waterway. I have deer in my backyard all the time, and I can't plant apple trees because they eat all the leaves off the tree before they can grow. One summer, I noticed large rocks in my backyard as if someone was throwing them on there to try and ruin my lawnmower. Several times, all in a week or two, I had to pick rocks off my lawn. I thought maybe that it was a neighbor, but I had no idea why he would do such a thing. We were good friends, and my closest neighbor was way down the road. This continued for several weeks, and then it abruptly stopped. It was all very strange. Later that year, in the late fall, it was cold enough that I had to have all the windows closed and the heat on to take the chill off the house at night. My brother was up from New York City visiting, and we were up late, and both of us were playing games on our computers. I use headphones when I play. It was around 12:30 at night, and while playing, I kept hearing a funny noise, and I thought that the game had a glitch in the sound. That noise started and stopped several times. It happened over a 5 or 10 minute period, and I found it to be very annoying. All of a sudden, it got louder, and I realized that it was not the game, and took off my headphones only to hear that it was coming from out back of my house. I went out to the back porch, and it was then that I heard an awful scream. It sounded like a woman being strangled to death in the woods about 100 yards behind my house in the swamp. There are no roads in that swamp, and it is a hike to get back there. Furthermore, who would be back there so late at night? I grew up on a farm and have been in the woods all over the world, from jungles of Cambodia to the jungles of Central America, northern Canada, from East Coast America, South Florida to the Rockies. I heard just about every animal there is in the wild, but this sound was nothing like anything I had ever heard. It sounded like a woman, but it had the volume and pitch of a large animal that weighed 1,000 pounds or more. Pitch and volume are an indicator of size. A mouse cannot sound like a bull, nor can a bull sound like a mouse. Whatever this thing was, it had to be very big and have a lung capacity of a 2,000-pound bull. Imagine that noise being so loud that I heard it from 100 yards away at night with the windows and doors closed and having headphones on while I was playing a video game. Since then, I have seen and heard others who describe that very same noise, and even heard a recording on one of the Bigfoot shows that sounds just like that noise. If there is someone going around and hoaxing this, they must get around a lot and have the resources to travel from coast to coast, which I don't believe they do. However, as a scientist and not actually seeing this creature, I cannot say it was a Bigfoot. But what else could it have been? I can't say that any of these experiences prove the existence of Bigfoot. However, there is something out there that is very large and that many have not seen. I do know that some creatures are very elusive, and although they are almost always right under people's noses, they are never seen. Signed, John. Well, John, that's awesome, man. I love it when people relate stories that they've heard from other people. We don't get too many of those, but I've had 3 or 4 of them, and sometimes there's not much to them, but they're still really interesting. And then your anecdotal type experiences, you being a wildlife person or scientist, or not sure what you do, but scientists go on evidence. They just go on evidence. They only believe what they can see. And I think it's unusual that you actually think there's something out there that none of us have seen, or that, that really stays out there so that people can't see it. Well, I take that back. Only some of us can see it. Anyway, I thought it was a great email, and I really appreciate you sending it in. Thanks, John. Okay, that's going to wind it up for this one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys on the next video. Love every one of you. Thank you.